Hi, I'm Andrew Torres, and this is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 95 of the Naked Mormonism Podcast, the serial Mormon history podcast. Today is Thursday, March 22nd, 2018. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. On this episode, we examine when Joe's Mormonism became a business venture just as much as a religion. It didn't take long into Mormon history before God felt the need to interfere with church finances. From that time forward, revelation after revelation centered on money just as much as ecclesiastical matters. We discuss the nuances of the land contracts Joseph Smith signed with Isaac Galland and Horace Hotchkiss to create a sanctuary for the Mormon refugees to settle. How does the church's business-centric roots impact its operation and motives today? Let's find out. Before we get into the history, today just have a little bit of housekeeping to do. Last episode, I said Thomas B. Marsh a number of times instead of Robert B. Thompson. I don't know, for some reason, I just get those mixed up so much. Thompson, Thomas, the same middle initial, B. So I noticed in the editing room that I said Thomas B. Marsh a couple of times that I had to correct that, but I missed the one at the introduction in the description of the show. So just a quick correction. I was made aware of that by Brad. So thanks for sending in that correction, Brad. I appreciate it. I don't get the people mixed up. I just get the names mixed up. Thomas B. Marsh, we won't hear from him for a number of years. Anyway, so also one more thing, this episode you're about to listen to, this is just a history episode, okay? So the reason I'm doing this is because regularly we have the history segment and then an interview segment afterwards, but instead, next week I'm going to be at the Protect LDS Children March, so I'm not going to be able to put together a regular historical timeline episode, so that means you're getting twice the history this week, and then next week, we're going to try to work through the recent PR nightmare for the church. That is the Joseph Bishop sexual assault leak. This is an interview. We'll talk about it next week. If you're listening to this long after it's aired in the backlogs, I'll give you an entire rundown of this whole story. We're hoping we'll have Ryan and Ethan of the Mormon Leaks team join us because that's where the audio actually came from. If they are unable to, then it's just going to be me deconstructing this for next week's episode. That's going to air a couple of days earlier than regular, just so people can consume it before the Protect LDS Children March. So, all of that said, come to the Protect LDS Children March. It is an effort to combat the incredible amount of control that the bishops exercise over ecclesiastical matters. That is the central focus of the Protect LDS Children March. It's on March 30th. Listen to later on in the episode to get other updates. So, with that, let's get into the show. And a fair warning to those of you with, what can I say, a fragile eardrums. At the end of this episode, I kind of let the old Bryce out. Fair warning. Good luck to you. Did Joseph Smith start Mormonism just for the money? You know, that's actually a question that's worth asking and one which isn't really answerable. At the latest Sunstone Symposium in July of 2017, Mormon historian Christopher C. Smith made the argument that Joseph never intended on starting a religion and that it was Oliver Cowdery's idea to begin with the religion. According to Christopher Smith, Joe had to be convinced to start Mormonism as his initial intention was just to publish the Book of Mormon and live off of the sales of the book. Chris's presentation was compelling, to say the least, but I have to say I think he was ignoring much of the Smith family dynamic leading to the publishing of the Book of Mormon, which may have caused Joe to entertain the idea of starting a religion that it might be a good idea. The Smith family attended a number of religions prior to Mormonism's inception. Methodism, Presbyterianism, a couple of these religions we have unequivocal documentary evidence of the Smiths attending, but they may have attended multiple religions for varying periods of time throughout Joe's teenage and early adult life. And what were more appealing than the brick-and-mortar religions were these public religious revivals with altar calls. Those were frequently held in town squares or public assembly halls, or sometimes just in large open fields. And really, we wouldn't expect to find any documentary evidence of the Smiths attending these open-air revivals, but if they followed the religious world the way many of their neighbors did, we can assume they attended at least a few of these larger revivals in the Palmyra and Manchester area. I mean, they may have even traveled to nearby Rochester, the largest shipping and trading city within a day's journey from the Smiths, where revivals were happening all the time through the 1820s. Now, with the completion of the Erie Canal in 1826, a whole new mode of cheap and efficient transportation opened Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and all other large cities on the shores of the Great Lakes to New York, bringing an influx of traders, businessmen, and, most importantly for our purposes, preachers. The Burned-Over district in which Joseph matured was home to hundreds of these religious revivals over the period from 1815 to 1835. The preachers leading these revivals were often career preachers, making their living from being the most charismatic preacher around, at least until the next charismatic preacher came along. The Smith family grew up on scraps, clothed in rags. They were destitute. In fact, Joseph Sr. in the late 1810s actually spent 30 days in a debtor's prison for failing to fulfill the obligations of a business contract. The only way the Smiths were able to afford their Manchester farmhouse was because Alvin Smith's industrious fortitude made him able to pay the first 2 payments as co-signer for the land deed. For a family growing up in poverty, to see revival preachers with tailored suits and their entourages of followers fawning over them, it must have had a dramatic impact on the Smiths, and Joseph Jr. specifically. I mean, just imagine it, sitting in the congregation and watching that collection plate circulate the crowd with enough money to keep the Smith family fed for months. What a dream it would be to have that coming to young Joe instead of to the finely clothed priestcraft up on the stage. Fast forward to publishing the Book of Mormon, Martin Harris, or Not So Smarty Marty as we know him, mortgaged his farm to fund the 5,000 original copies of the Book of Mormon. Joe heard that some people or organizations in Canada were buying copyrights of history books, and in response to this unsubstantiated rumor, Joe sent on 2 separate occasions missionaries to Canada to find a buyer for the Book of Mormon copyright, to sell it out from underneath Not So Smarty Marty. I think this fact alone illustrates to us that Joe was motivated by whatever would bring him some fast cash, ignoring any long-term ramifications. And Not So Smarty Marty must have been a bit reluctant to make good on the contract for the Book of Mormon because the first revelation in the Book of Commandments, which refers to anything monetary, was directed at Marty. This is the first time Joe's God interfered in money. This is included in the Book of Commandments, chapter 16, which is modern-day Doctrine and Covenants, section 19. Quote, "For behold, the mystery of godliness, how great is it? For behold, I am endless, and the punishment which is given from my hand is endless punishment, for endless is my name. Wherefore, I command you by my name and by my almighty power, that you repent. Repent, lest I smite you by the rod of my mouth, and by my wrath, and by my anger, and your sufferings be sore. How sore, you know not. How exquisite, you know not. Yea, how hard to bear, you know not. For behold, I, God, have suffered these things, that they might not suffer, if they would repent. But if they would not repent, they must suffer even as I." Now, on to verse 25, invoking God's wrath right at the onset, down to verse 25. "And again I command you," this is commanding Martin Harris, this is all directed at Martin Harris, Not So Smarty Marty. "And again I command you, that thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor seek thy neighbor's life. And again I command you, that thou shalt not covet thine own property, but impart it freely to the printing of the Book of Mormon, which contains the truth and the word of God." End quote. There it is. Impart it freely. Your property, Marty. Give your property freely to the printing of the Book of Mormon. Now, if we actually look to the Book of Commandments, chapter 26, this is modern day Doctrine and Covenants, section 25, we actually see the genesis of the first rift between Joe and Oliver Cowdery, Ollie Cowdung, with this passage directed to the prophet's wife, Emma Smith. Quote, And thou shalt go with him. This is, and Emma saying Emma should go with Joseph at the time of his going, and be unto him for a scribe, that I may send all of our cowdry whithersoever I will. And thou shalt be ordained under his hand to expound scriptures, and to exhort the church according as it shall be given thee by my Spirit. For he shall lay his hands upon thee, and thou shalt receive the Holy Ghost, and thy time shall be given for writing and to learning much. And here is the point where God interferes once again with money. And thou needest not fear, for thy husband shall support thee from the church. For unto them is his calling, that all things might be revealed unto them, whatsoever I will, according to their faith. End quote. This revelation right here said that Joe would be supported by the church, and that his wife Emma wouldn't need to worry about money anymore because they had a church with followers to fill their pockets. These two revelations mark God's first interference into monetary affairs with Joe's new religion. The revelation we just read about Joe and Emma being supported by the church came along a mere 3 months after the church was started in 1830. One thing we need to sit back and kind of consider here is maybe this shouldn't be an issue, right? Because the church simply couldn't operate without some kind of income. With all the projects undertaken by the early church, a steady flow of money was crucial to bring the projects to light. Most of these projects were merely land acquisition and building on said land, but one of the main purposes for needing income came about as Joe's palate for the upper class became increasingly jaded against his previous mediocre lifestyle. Even before this actual revelation came about, Joe was focused on getting money from wealthy locals. When Joe first met not-so-smarty Marty Harris, Joe approached Marty and told him that God had given Joe a revelation that the first honest man he met would give him $50. Granted that $50 in 1826 is over $1,100 in today's money, so that's a hefty sum, but that $50 was a lot to the 20-year-old prophet at the time. And you fast forward a mere decade from 1826, and Joe is dealing with contracts and businesses worth thousands of dollars. Expand that to encompass another 5 years, and we arrive in 1841, where our current timeline resides, and Joe is suddenly throwing around tens of thousands of dollars in these massive land contracts for thousands of acres. But that money was rarely liquid specie. Most of the money that Joe dealt with was in the form of mercantile commodities or land deeds. New York Joe was working with tens of dollars. Nauvoo Joe, a mere 10 years later, was working with tens of thousands of dollars. So let's spend a bit of time talking about Joe's financial portfolio in 1841, now that we've examined the monetary affairs of the very early church. From everything which transpired in Kirtland, Ohio, Joe found himself $40,000 to $60,000 in debt. He fled the state, but those debts were still attached to his name. The city was able to seize the 3-story printing office building next to the Kirtland Temple to try and absolve some of the debts, but the building was burned to the ground by an unknown arsonist as soon as it was auctioned off to one of Joe's many creditors. Church finances in Missouri were in no better shape than they were in Kirtland. The Mormons had been squatting with the hopes of purchasing Missouri land for extremely cheap. When the land they were squatting on came up for auction, much of it was purchased by Gentile Missourians who wanted the Mormons off of their newly acquired land that they were squatting on. This was one of many factors which caused the Missourians to remove the Mormons and send them out of the state of Missouri. Then, during Joe's internment in Liberty Jail after the Missouri-Mormon War of 1838, he shared a bit of letter correspondence with one Isaac Galland, who had deeds to thousands of acres in Iowa and Illinois right on the shores of the Mississippi. Galland had the deeds to the land, but that unfortunately didn't mean a whole lot as the land ownership in Iowa had been so much speculated on that simply having a deed in hand didn't grant total ownership. We'll get into that in a minute. Galland did own some 20,000 acres in what was known as the half-breed tract in Iowa. The land had been acquired after the government executed the teeth of the Indian Removal Act and located the thousands of Native Americans living in the Iowa Territory. This land had been acquired by treaty, quote-unquote treaty, after the government had executed the teeth of the Indian Removal Act and relocated the thousands of Native Americans living in the Iowa Territory. This half-breed tract was the source of land speculation and businessmen vacillating between investing in the area in hopes of it becoming a new metropolis with high land values and then, alternatively dumping their holdings when they saw just how undesirable the land was and they extrapolated accurate conclusions of the area's lack of appeal. Land deeds were traded back and forth constantly, and courts were forced to get involved to make small settlements based on the incredibly confusing nature of these trades in the half-breed tract. Oftentimes, let's just work with a hypothetical here. One man, let's say Steve. Steve would purchase a land deed for a few hundred acres from another man, Bill, who had previously purchased a few thousand acres and broken the land up into smaller lots for split sales. Then Steve would subdivide out his few hundred acres and sell them off at slightly raised value to a third party, let's say John, who may have been purchasing multiple blocks of hundreds of acres in order to consolidate the land into a single block to sell for an exorbitant rate. Now, each of these steps would increase the dollar per acre value of the land, but nobody was settling in the area en masse to justify the inflation. It was just a matter of guessing the value of an empty paper bag. Then somebody, let's say Dave this time, would approach the original owner of the thousands of acres, that's Bill, before Steve and John purchased their land after they subdivided and consolidated the land, and Dave would then accuse Bill of having a fraudulent land deed and contend that the land belonged to Dave in the first place. And then they'd take the issue to court and resolve it there. Of course, the court would rule Bill's original deeds to be fraudulent, which would send the land to Dave, who brought the accusation of fraud because he had an earlier land deed in his hands, which showed all of the acreage was actually his that Bill, Steve, and John were trying to buy and sell. But of course, Bill just happened to lose the paperwork, so he couldn't prove that Dave had sold the land to him. So now all of the land deeds with Bill, Steve, and John's name are nullified by a court, and Dave, this guy that came along after all of these land deals had transpired, he ends up retaining all of their land with his original deed. Then it turns out that the original deed that Dave had presented to the court to get all of the land back was actually fraudulent because Mark, that's a new guy, who sold the original land to Dave before Bill, John, and Steve got involved, simply fabricated his land deeds to lay claim to thousands of acres that he got on trade from a Black Hawk War veteran who initially was given thousands of acres by the government because Mark gave that veteran a nice place to live in Springfield, Illinois. But of course, Dave, Bill, John, Steve, all of them feel like they got screwed over by each other when it was Mark's fault all along in the first place for laying claim with fraudulent land deeds, all because he made a handshake deal with that war veteran. Okay, this crazy complex web hypothetical that we just proposed, that similar stuff like that made up the majority of the land disputes in the half-breed tract. And it caused a lot of hard feelings and unfair court rulings when they attempted to nullify the chaos and reduce the land speculation. All one must do is replace the names of these men, of these hypothetical men that I proposed, with actual companies, like the New York Land Company, who are practicing this speculation on a large scale. And that makes this analogy perfectly applicable. Not even an analogy, it just makes it what was going on. So one man caught up in all of the speculation of fraudulent land deeds and buying and selling government contracts on all of these thousands of acres was Isaac Galland, with whom the prophet had shared correspondence from Liberty Jail. Joe had already agreed to buy Galland's 20,000 acres of half-breed tract in Iowa. Now I'm going to let Lyndon W. Cook from BYU Studies take it away from here, giving a brief synopsis of Galland's professional career in land speculation. You'll find a link to this entire article. It's titled Isaac Galland, Mormon Benefactor in the show notes, should you choose to read it. Quote, after unsuccessfully running for the Iowa State Legislature in 1834, Isaac Galland began his notorious career of land speculation in Iowa. Much of Galland's land dealings involved the half-breed tract, a 119,000-acre parcel of land lying between the Des Moines and Mississippi rivers in the southeast corner of Iowa, which had been set aside as a reservation for half-breed Sac and Fox Indians. Despite the questionable legality of land transactions in the half-breed tract, the area was soon flooded with settlers and land speculators. In 1836, the New York Land Company, later to merge with the St. Louis Land Company, made extensive land purchases in the reservation. Isaac Galland was one of 5 trustees for the New York Land Company. He also purchased large tracts of land in his own name, both in the half-breed reservation and in the Commerce, Hancock County, Illinois. Dr. Galland, who at one time was appointed Special Land Commissioner for Hancock County, also platted the original town of Keokuk in 1837. Now continuing from later in the article, Isaac Galland's association with the Mormons began in October or November of 1838 when he met Isaac Barlow, who, with other Mormons, had fled northeastward towards Quincy, Illinois from far west Missouri. but by missing their way, had arrived at the Des Moines River in Iowa. They observed the abandoned barracks of Old Fort Des Moines near what is now Montrose, and were informed that Isaac Galland held extensive claims to the area known as the Half-Breed Tract. Israel Barlow and his associates talked with Dr. Galland, who, after hearing of the Mormons' difficulties in Missouri, began negotiations with these destitute Mormons to sell them his lands and buildings in commerce, as well as in the Half-Breed Tract. Not authorized to make purchases for the church, Elder Barlow directed his course downstream to Quincy, after an exploring party had been sent to examine Galland's lands. Church leaders convened in Quincy to discuss the propriety of settling in Commerce and in Lee County, Iowa. William Marks presided at this meeting where Isaac Galland's liberal offer was presented. Dr. Galland had agreed to sell about 20,000 acres lying between the Mississippi and Des Moines rivers at $2 per acre to be paid in 20 annual installments without interest. End quote. Isaac Galland was paramount to the Mormon settlement, and he converted to Mormonism, likely out of self-interest, to ensure his business transactions went through. Galland ended up lobbying on behalf of the refugee Mormons by petitioning his friends, Attorney General Isaac Van Allen and Governor Robert Lucas of Iowa Territory, so that they would allow the transaction to be completed and allow the Mormons to begin settlement in the Iowa Territory. In Galland's letter to Governor Lucas, this is dated 25th February 1839, he said the following, quote, "I will come to the issue at once and ask on behalf of these much injured people your permission that they may purchase lands and settle thereon in the territory of Iowa, and there to worship Almighty God according to the dictates of their own consciences, secure from the robber's grasp, the ruffian's guns, and the midnight assassin's knife." End quote. Subsequently, permission was granted by Governor Lucas of Iowa, sharply contrasting the favors the Mormons had received from Missouri Governor Lilburn Boggs when he signed the Mormon extermination order. So, in response to all of these favors that Galland was doing for Joe signed the Galland contracts, and the Mormons were now on the hook for $50,000 in exchange for 20,000 acres in Iowa. Just as in our little hypothetical with Mark, Dave, Steve, John, all these guys, Galland's ownership of these contracted lands was highly disputed, yet he sold it to Joe and the Mormons anyway. And there's actually a brief footnote in Linda Cook's paper, and it offers an incredible history of how the Half-Breed Tract came to be a major source of confusion for land speculators and the court systems trying to rectify their mistake from when the land was initially appropriated. This is from the footnote. It's kind of long, but it really illustrates the point. Quote, "Congress, in August 1824, had reserved this tract, that's a half-breed tract, of land by treaty for the use of the mixed bloods of Sac and Fox Indian tribes. The United States maintained a revisionary interest in the land, and under the terms of the treaty, the half-breeds could not legally sell or convey the land." So when the United States government initially took over the property and made it a reservation for these quote-unquote half-breeds, they said that you can't sell or convey the land. It's very important to understand that detail. Continuing on. In the fall of 1833, a group of half-breeds met in Keokuk and prepared a petition to Congress requesting the passage of an act giving them the right to sell the land. Pursuant to this petition, Congress passed an act dated 30th June 1834, which relinquished the federal government's revisionary interests in the half-breed tract and gave the half-breeds the lands in fee simple. Congress failed to specify who the individual owners were. However, originally 40 claims were made for ownership. Later, the number reached 100, and finally 160. So people were just coming out of the woodworks and saying, hey, we have claim to this land. Hey, we're half-breeds. We have claim to it too. To rectify this mistake, the Wisconsin legislature in 1838 required all claimants to file claims with the District Court of Lee County within 1 year, showing how title was obtained. Trying to sort out this mess. 3 commissioners were to take testimony regarding said titles. In the meantime, the territory of Iowa was created, and the first session of the territorial legislature repealed the Wisconsin Act. So when Iowa finally became a recognized territory, they said, oh, that Wisconsin Act in 1838, we're going to completely ignore it. He continues, this action complicated the problem, and suits were subsequently filed in the territorial courts, resulting in the sale of the entire tract of 119,000 acres to Hugh T. Reed for $5,773.32. So all of this dispute, all of these people, over 160 people were disputing who owned the land. And this one guy comes along in the territory of Iowa courts and said, all of this land is mine. And the Iowa territory said, okay, give us $5,700. He continues, Reed, who received a deed executed by the sheriff of Lee County, subsequently sold several small tracts, but his title was obviously in question and became involved in litigation. This matter came before the second session in the territorial legislature, but nothing concrete occurred until 1841 in Spalding v. Antaya, U.S. District Court of Iowa Territory, which requested partition of the entire tract. A decree for partition was issued, and commissioners were appointed to divide the 119,000 acres into 101 tracts of equal value. This was done and confirmed by the courts in October 1841. This judgment of partition was sustained in a number of appeals to the Iowa Supreme Court, but the sheriff's sale to Hugh T. Reed still formed a cloud on that title. So, to just review before we finish up this footnote, this land, initially taken by treaty of the U.S. government in 1824, was litigated in 1834, then later in 1838, and then it was all nullified by Iowa becoming a territory in 1840, and then all of it was given to this single guy, Hugh T. Reed, who was not a half-breed, for $5,700, and then in 1841, all of his land was essentially nullified and his claim to the deed was nullified. And they said, okay, we're going to bring in a commission of people who are going to divide up the 119,000 acres into 101 tracts of equal value and partition it out to all of the people with claims. So, and all of this just further is confused by what happens next. In Webster v. Reed in District Court of Iowa in January 1846, it was decided that Hugh T. Reed was the owner in fee simple of the land in question. So all of this done between 1841 to 46, all of the partitioning was all nullified once again to go back to the original claim that Hugh T. Reed made for the $5,700. It's chaos and pandemonium. And think, this is 1841 to 46. This is in the middle of when the Mormons were settling in the area. So, we continue on. An appeal was taken to the United States Supreme Court, and in 1850, the High Court reversed Webster v. Reed, which gave all the land to Hugh T. Reed. This action set aside the sheriff's sale to Reed and sustained the judgment of partition, the 101 shares. Lawyers for the various land companies quit-claimed their interests in these lands for a reasonable consideration. The matter was finally settled. End quote. All of this chaos, everything that was going on at this time with this 119,000 acres that was so incredibly disputed was happening at the same time that the Mormons were settling there and buying up this land from Isaac Galland. So ownership of this Iowa land was steadily in dispute until 6 years after Joseph Carthage shootout assassination. But all of that said, Isaac Galland didn't seem too dissuaded from buying and selling the land to the Mormons, even with this cloud of chaos underlying every deed transaction occurring inside this 119,000 acres in Iowa. Galland's motivations seem clarified by an extant letter that he wrote a mere half-month after his conversion to Mormonism. This is also included in the article by Cook, which once again you'll find in the show notes. Quote, I feel greatly relieved in having got out of hearing of the half-breed lands. He was relieved, not having those lands attached to his name anymore. I have disposed of my half-breed lands for $50,000, that is to say $2,500 annually for 20 years. The people, meaning the Mormons, have also bought out Hugh White and some others and will probably continue to buy out the settlers of that neighborhood until they again acquire a sufficient quantity of honeycomb to induce the surrounding thieves to rob them again, at which time they will no doubt have to renounce their religion or submit to a repetition of similar acts of violence and outrage as they suffered in Missouri. End quote. So, to review, Galland was relieved of his burden of the half-breed tract ownership, and he was set to collect a handsome sum from the Mormons every year for 20 years from his land speculation. Okay? And he obviously understood that the popular uprising against Mormonism was going to happen again and be a repeat of everything that they suffered in Missouri. So, it's just interesting that Galland saw the writing on the wall while he was making these land deals with Joseph Smith. Now, regardless of how large of an institution you're running, $2,500, and adjusted for inflation, that's $57,000. Every year in the 1840s was a lot of money for one guy to collect and for one organization to have to divvy out. But Galland wasn't the only one with contracts signed by Joe compelling the Mormons to pay out massive sums of money. Always keep this small detail in mind. Joe was signing all of these contracts under his own name. It wasn't until late 1840 when he was named trustee in trust of the church finances, but every contract at that time which allowed the Mormons to settle on any land in Illinois and Iowa, those were all signed and attached to Joe's personal name. No corporation, no company, no religion. Now, historians have attempted painstakingly to reconstruct this tangled web of finances that Joe was involved in during his Nauvoo stay, but it simply can't be done. One issue making much of this reconstruction effort significantly more detailed is just how many deals Joe made without properly filing paperwork with local government authorities. Most of these land contracts were drawn up, signed, and simply squirreled away in one of many filing boxes, and the mess that Joe left behind was one of Emma and Louis Bideman's greatest sources of frustration and contention. Add into this mess the fact that Joe's debts from Ohio and Missouri didn't go anywhere. They didn't just evaporate when he left the state. Joe was still on the hook for tens of thousands of dollars from the previous decade of being prophet-in-chief. On the 15th of January 1841, an issue of the Times of Seasons went out in celebration of the great fortunes the saints were enjoying. Joe made it a point to praise the behavior of Isaac Galland when he said this from the Vogel History of the Church, Volume 4, page 267, quote, Dr. Isaac Galland, also, who is one of our benefactors, having under his control a large quantity of land in the immediate vicinity of our city, and a considerable portion of the city plot, opened both his heart and his hands when we were as strangers took us in, and bade us welcome to share with him in his abundance, leaving his dwelling house, the most splendid edifice in the vicinity, for our accommodation, and partook himself to small uncomfortable dwelling. He sold us his large estates on very reasonable terms and on long credit, so that we might have an opportunity of paying for them without being distressed, and has since taken our lands in Missouri in payment for the whole amount, and has given us a clear and indisputable title for the same. And in addition to the first purchase, we have exchanged lands with him in Missouri to the amount of $80,000. He is the honored instrument the Lord used to prepare a home for us when we were driven from our inheritances, having given him control of vast bodies of land and prepared his heart to make the use of the Lord intended he should." End quote. In this one press release, Joe was clearly using his power of discernment to decide whether or not these land purchase agreements were legitimate or not. But let's put a pin in Galland for a minute. We'll pick up with him once we've sufficiently discussed the Hotchkiss land agreement. Another land speculator who approached the Mormon refugees was Horace Hotchkiss. We briefly discussed both Galland and Hotchkiss in episode 72, Nauvoo, Divine and Speculation. If you'd like to get an introduction to this subject, go listen to that episode. Hugh and William White, Isaac Galland, Horace Hotchkiss, and a small number of other land speculators were drawn to the investment opportunity presenting itself with the Mormons moving to Iowa and Illinois en masse. Hotchkiss owned a few hundred acres of commerce when he approached the Mormons with his deal. This is from Robert Flanders' Nauvoo, Kingdom on the Mississippi, beginning with page 41. Quote, "The Hotchkiss purchase was for Smith and the church the greatest business venture since the Kirtland Bank. Hotchkiss apparently knew a city when he saw one coming upon his property. Accordingly, the price was high, considering the approaching deflation and monetary stringency. The purchase was in the form of a land contract. The church to have possession of the property, but not the deeds until the debt was paid. Apparently, no money was paid down, and the terms were entailed in a series of notes. 2 notes of $25,000, one maturing in 10 and one in 20 years, seem to have been the principal. There were 40 additional notes of $1,500 each, 2 of which were due every 12 months for 20 years. These were apparently the interest, 8% a year, simple interest on $50,000. There were 2 additional notes of $1,250, one due in 5 years and the other in 10. So the church was to pay the Hotchkiss partners $3,000 each year for 20 years, plus $1,250 the 5th year, $26,250 the 10th year, and $25,000 the 20th year. The total amount was $114,500. Smith subsequently claimed that Hotchkiss had agreed verbally that no interest was to be charged, but the contracts do not suggest any such agreement. End quote. Now, the most complicated issue with all these land agreements was the fact that the church and Joe had absolutely no capital to throw at these ventures. Joe simply signed the contracts with no down payments, with the understanding that the terms were sufficient enough to forego interest payments. This Horace Hotchkiss guy seems to be a stand-up businessman, but by the few available indicators, we can't say the same of Isaac Galland. Hotchkiss spent years in Nauvoo trying to make Joe stick to the contracts they'd signed in late 1849. Hotchkiss was measured and realistic in his approach with dealing with the Mormons, knowing full well their financial situation and the hardships they were suffering since being exiled from Missouri. So let's take the pin back out of Galland now and catch up with him. As Galland was reasonably well connected in politics and land speculation, he was appointed to the office of land agent for the church after his baptism, and he subsequently spent much of late 1839 all the way to early 1841 traveling to sort out the complex web of assets and liabilities Joe had woven in the past decade of his dealings as prophet of the new Mormon religion. Much of the reasoning behind Galland's traveling was due to self-interest. While no extant documents prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Joe successfully traded land the Mormons already possessed in order to reconcile the contracts with Galland, a few notes show payment to Galland in the form of land contracts in Missouri and Ohio, but these few documents only reconcile a few $1,000s of the outstanding original $50,000 figure. Now, one of Joe's earliest revelations, included in Doctrine and Covenants section 38 today, was delivered in January 1831. That's less than a year after the church was started. It says in part, quote, "Wherefore, for this cause I gave unto you the commandment that ye should go to the Ohio, and there I will give unto you my law, and there you shall be endowed with power from on high. And from thenceforth, whomsoever I will shall go forth among all nations, and I shall be told them what they shall do, for I have a great work laid up in store." Now this is the important part. "Now I give unto the church in these parts a commandment, that certain men among them shall be appointed, and they shall be appointed by the voice of the church, and they shall look to the poor and the needy, and administer to their relief, but they shall not suffer, and send them forth to the place which I have commanded them. And this shall be their work to govern the affairs of the property of this church." And finally, the very most important part of this revelation, "And they that have farms that cannot be sold, let them be left or rented as seemeth them good." End quote. So this revelation right here says that those people who are living in New York or in areas that are not Ohio, abandon your property or rent it out as you can and get to Ohio. I mean, this revelation alone seems to exhibit Joe's simple lack of understanding basic economics. This was a divine command for everybody in New York and the areas roundabout to sell the property and goods that they had and immediately move to Ohio. If they can't sell their property, they should rent it. If they can't rent it, then leave it behind. I mean, sure, this revelation may work on an individual basis, but there was somewhere around 100 Mormons at this time, and just throwing this revelation out there carte blanche to telling them to abandon their property shows an inability to empathize with just how challenging it is to just pick up roots and move to a whole new location. But this did have some interesting effects. Before we get into the meat of our 1841 historical timeline today and pick up with Isaac Galland and Horace Hotchkiss, we need to take a quick break. I told you at the beginning, I'm not going to shut up about the Protect LDS Children campaign because this is an important, crucial event in Mormon history. We together are writing Mormon history as we see it in the beginning of the 21st century. This is something that needs to be done. If you are in Utah and you have the ability and opportunity to make it to the Protect LDS Children March, that is on March 30th, we are gathering at Washington Square Park, that is at 451 State Street in Salt Lake City. We are marching 5 blocks to the church office building, and we will be gathering at a local park there for a bit of mingling afterwards. This is an important event. This is how we make our voices heard by the church. This is how pressure is put on the church to change their doctrine and policy, and there is not a more crucial time to make this happen. In light of recent events, which we'll be getting to later in the episode, Pressure needs to be felt by the church. There needs to be public headlines coming out in national news media coverage that they see that thousands of people are marching in the streets of Salt Lake City to force the church to change something that they are doing. The church needs to hear our voices as we stand in solidarity against the abuse that is happening at the hands of the bishops and the church leaders. This needs to happen. I see the download numbers. I know that a lot of the listeners here that are hearing my voice right now live in Utah. I'm making the trip down from Seattle, flying in just for this. And if I can make that trip, I know it's on a business day, you should be able to as well. If it's not too much of an inconvenience to protect LDS children, I sincerely hope to see you at the march. Please, if you are able and capable of making this happen, and this is an issue which you care about, I implore you to exert your power as a member of a democratic society where we have the ability and legal right to stand together in a group and march for or against an issue that we see as a problem for society. This is a historic event. Please help us. This revelation that Joe gave for everybody to just pick up everything and move to Ohio, among a small handful of other revelations, meant that the Mormons had land and property holdings scattered all across the eastern states in 1841. In order to pay for these Nauvoo contracts, Joe decided that it was high time to tap into all of those resources, especially in Missouri and Ohio. Luckily for Joe and his fellow land speculators, the Mormons had just compiled at the end of 1839 itemized lists of their property they left behind when they were violently removed from the state of Missouri. This folder of affidavits was compiled to petition the U.S. government for remuneration. But by September of 1841, it was widely understood that the government had no interest in paying the Mormons for their sufferings, especially not to the tune of $1 million as they were petitioning for. That already compiled data was used to set prices on the land that they had left behind in Missouri in order to pay Hotchkiss, Galland, and White for the property they had signed over to Joe. Now, there's a certain logic to what Joe was trying to do with these incredibly complex land agreements. The Mormons who followed Joe weren't using their land in Ohio and Missouri anymore, and there were hundreds or thousands of acres in those states attached to Mormons who were actively settling in Nauvoo, Illinois, and, on the other side of the Mississippi in Iowa. And they didn't need that land anymore. So if Joe could just sign these various contracts for land in Illinois and Iowa and sell off or trade Mormon land in Missouri and Ohio in exchange, he's unloading unwanted liabilities while gaining capital where he wants it in a consolidated geography. Even if he couldn't sell the unused land and pay off these contracts, it would hopefully alleviate some of the principal and reduce the overbearing stress Joe was experiencing being so far in debt. Isaac Galland was on board with his land trading business. Hotchkiss, however, seemed to want cash instead. As a certified land agent for the church, Isaac Galland set out, possibly in late 1839, maybe in early 1840, in order to collect land deeds from Mormons in the eastern states who owned land in Missouri, Ohio, New York, Pennsylvania, and it was in an effort to try and capitalize on some of the contracts that he had signed with Joe. However, a fatal flaw in this plan was realized when Galland spent inordinate amounts of time in Kirtland, Ohio, without much letter correspondence between him and the prophet. Who knows who he was talking to out there? Joe must have realized at some point that not only was he on the hook to pay Galland $50,000 for the various contracts, but that Galland held much of the financial future of the church in his hands while he was petitioning people to sign over their land back to Joe in order to pay Galland back. There's a conflict of interests here. Joe was always trying to make good on the contracts with Horace Hotchkiss, who waxed impatient with the prophet's lack of liquid capital. As Flanders noted in his book, for whatever reason, Joe was under the impression that the deal with Horace Hotchkiss didn't include interest. According to Joe, he and Hotchkiss had a verbal agreement that it was principal alone included in the contracts, yet the contracts themselves seemed to bear out the fact that 8% interest was steadily accruing on Joe's tab with Hotchkiss, and that $114,000 amount just kept growing. Joe relied on Isaac Galland to acquire the deeds to pay back the Hotchkiss bills, but what he was able to collect couldn't even cover the interest on the Hotchkiss bills. By the summer of 1841, Horace Hotchkiss had only been paid back pennies on the dollar so far, with the accruing interest soaking up much more than Joe could ever pay off. Joe needed Isaac Galland to deliver on acquiring some of the Mormon lands in order to be able to trade towards the outstanding balances with Hotchkiss. Galland spent an inordinate amount of time in Kirtland, Ohio. Now, if we recall back, Kirtland was the headquarters of the church from 1831 to 37, and hundreds of Mormons still lived there who are considered to be in apostasy by Joe's Nauvoo church. Part of Galland's mission was also to procure loans from Mormons abroad, partially to pay back the contracts, but more so to fund the publication of the 1840 Nauvoo Book of Mormon and other printed materials to fund the Nauvoo House Project, the temple, and a bunch of other public projects that Nauvoo needed in order to become a sustainable community. So Galland was trying to collect loans and land deeds and any property that he could from Mormons abroad in order to help fund the building of Nauvoo. But they were spreading way too little resources, far too thin. Now from page 128 of Flanders' Nauvoo Kingdom on the Mississippi, quote, "Perhaps of all the perplexities of temporal affairs, none made Joseph Smith more anxious to return to the responsibilities of the spirit than the Hotchkiss indebtedness. The correspondence between the church and the Connecticut land dealer, from whom the church had purchased a large tract on the flat on land contract in 1839, chronicles the fiscal problems of Nauvoo and the tortured attempts made to solve them. Hotchkiss was delicate, but persistent about his interest in the saints' pecuniary affairs and their ability to retire the $3,000 in notes due to mature each 12 month." End quote. At the time when Hotchkiss's first payment came due, Joe had just returned from Washington, D.C. in his petition to get redress for the saints suffering during their exodus from Missouri. Flanders continues, quote, "The saints entertained great expectations that there would be some substantial settlement made. Indeed, that was the implicit object of the petitions. Hotchkiss had been assured that the success of the project would underwrite the Nauvoo land purchase." End quote. And that was the plan all along in Joe's mind. He would sign all of these land contracts, and then he'd get a huge payout from the United States government to pay all of these contracts back, and then he would go about building Nauvoo without going into debt. You can go back to episodes 58, Fop or Fool for a Puttis, and episode 61, Congressional Deafening, to get the backstory on how this petition to the government went. Suffice it to say, after weeks of lobbying, the Mormons received no redress for their plight, and Joe's entire plan fell apart. However, he'd already signed all of the contracts, and the first payments for the contracts were coming due in the very near future. Horace Hotchkiss was well aware that the government had denied helping the Mormons financially, and he seemed aware that he was supposed to be repaid from that money, and suddenly that money wouldn't be coming anytime soon. As soon as the government officially denied paying the Mormons, Hotchkiss was, from that time forward, stuck with the Mormons. As the first payment came due to Hotchkiss, Joe decided to appeal to Hotchkiss's emotions, claiming that the Mormons' industriousness was plenty of capital to repay the debt. Once again from Flanders, quote, "The greatest reliance you have for regaining your wealth is in the honorable conduct of your people, their pure morals, their correct habits, their indefatigable industry, their untiring perseverance, and their well-directed enterprise. These constitute a capital which can never be shaken by man." End quote. Unfortunately, you can't buy more land with indefatigable industry. According to Flanders, Hotchkiss's concerns were assuaged by this claim that the Mormons were good-hearted and industrious people, which caused Hotchkiss to propose another land transaction between himself and the prophet, to which the prophet responded. This is from the History of the Church, Dan Vogel edition, volume 4, page 100. Quote, "It would afford me great pleasure indeed could I hold out any prospect of the 2 notes, for $1,500 each, due next month, being met at maturity, or even this fall. Having had considerable difficulty, necessarily consequent on a new settlement, to contend with, as well as poverty and considerable sickness, our first payment will probably be somewhat delayed, until we again get a good start in the world. The prospect is indeed favorable. However, every exertion on our part shall be made to meet the demands against us, so that if we cannot accomplish all we wish to, it is our misfortune, and not our fault." End quote. That was a letter sent in July of 1840, and tensions between the prophet and his various business partners in land speculation rose from that time forward. Hotchkiss became more insistent, which coincided with Galland becoming increasingly harder to get a hold of. To review the complex web of land deals being traded, Flanders summarizes with the following, quote, "The technique was to send agents among the saints in the East to convince them to move to Nauvoo and to give them bills of exchange for the titles to their property. These bills could be cashed in Nauvoo for lots or farmlands of comparable value. The agents would give the titles to eastern lands thus acquired to Hotchkiss in an amount sufficient to pay the notes due him, and if possible, sell the rest. Hotchkiss agreed to this arrangement." End quote. So this was the initial agreement. Take Mormon lands east of Nauvoo and use those land deeds to pay back the Hotchkiss bill. And the bills that they were collecting from the Mormons, all of these land deeds, they could be cashed in Nauvoo to get farms, lands, acreage that's comparable to what they signed over from their property in the eastern states. But that was just the initial agreement. However, once Hotchkiss understood the cumbersome and delayed nature by which this would return on his investment, he changed his mind. Now we're going back to Lyndon Cook's article on Isaac Galland. Quote, "Since Horace Hotchkiss had verbally agreed to accept land in the Atlantic states in lieu of cash payments, Joseph Smith was optimistic that his land agents could completely cancel the Hotchkiss debt, both principal and interest. Upon speaking with Mr. Hotchkiss prior to Hiram Smith's departure, the two agents found that he had changed his mind, and he would only accept land titles for the interest which was accruing. Upon receiving this information, Dr. Isaac Galland agreed to effect the transfer of sufficient eastern lands to Hotchkiss to meet the accruing interest, which equaled $6,000 by the summer of 1841. End quote. It was at this time that the relationship between Joe and Galland soured. Joe was under the impression that Galland would transfer property to Hotchkiss in order to make good on the accruing interest, but Galland had other plans in mind. You can sense the rising tension in letter exchanges between Hotchkiss and Joe throughout 1841 into early 1832. After Joe had received a letter from Hotchkiss with some rather strong persuasions to work harder to acquire money to pay the interest on the loans, Joe fired back a letter in July of 1841, which reads in part from the Vogel History of the Church, Volume 4, page 402, quote, "Dear Sir," this is from Joseph to Horace Hotchkiss, "I presume you are well aware of the difficulties that occurred before and at the execution of the writings in regard to the landed transaction between us, touching the annual payments of interest. If you have forgotten, I will here remind you, you verbally agreed on our refusal and hesitancy to execute the notes for the payments for the land, that you would not exact the payment of the interest that you would accrue on them under 5 years, and that you would not coerce the payment even then. To all this you pledged your honor, and upon an after arrangement, you verbally agreed to take land in some one of the Atlantic states that would yield 6% interest to you, both for the principal and interest. And in view of the matter, I delegated my brother Hiram and Dr. Isaac Galland to go east and negotiate for lands with our friends, and pay you off for the whole purchase that we made of you. But upon an interview with you, they learned that you were unwilling to enter into an arrangement according to the powers that I had delegated them, that you would not receive any of the principal at all, but the interest alone, which we never considered ourselves in honor or in justice bound to pay under the expiration of 5 years. I presume you are no stranger to the part of the city plat we bought of you being a deathly sick hole, and that we've not been able in consequence to realize any valuable consideration from it. And now to be goaded by you for a breach of good faith and neglect and dishonorable conduct seems to me to be almost beyond endurance." End quote. And the rest of the letter just details the plight of the refugee saints and what they had suffered at the hands of the Missouri government, and then it concludes with a postscript which reads as such, quote, "Since writing the above, I had had a conference with my brother Hiram, who informs me when he left Pennsylvania that he left with Dr. Isaac Galland nearly enough of real estate in the hands of the doctor to liquidate the amount due you. My brother, having been compelled to return in consequence of ill health, expecting that the doctor would have the matter arranged long before this. Therefore, so soon as we learn the particulars from Dr. Galland, we will take such measures as will most likely meet your approval." End quote. So to summarize that really quickly, Horace Hotchkiss was sending letters, strongly worded letters to Joseph Smith saying, "Hey, what's the deal with defaulting on the very first payment?" And Joe said, "Hey, you sold us terrible land." How did he say it? "A deathly sick hole that we haven't been able to realize any valuable consideration from." And then Joe says, to be goaded by you? That's almost beyond endurance, in my opinion. So, and then he says, but I was informed after I met with my brother Hiram that Isaac Galland has enough land contracts in his hands to liquidate what we owe to you. We just have to wait for Dr. Galland to get back from the eastern states to rearrange everything and make sure that we make good on the payments that we owe you. So, after a few months in the eastern states acquiring all of these land deeds and the donations for various Nauvoo projects, Isaac Galland finally returned west to Keokuk, Iowa. The problem with this is Galland had essentially been silent with any correspondence with the prophet, and Joe had only learned of what transpired through his brother, Hiram's sidekick Abiff Smith. Telling of his absence, Flanders details how Galland's silence caused much of the rift between Horace Hotchkiss and Joe. This is from page 132 of Kingdom on the Mississippi. Quote, Smith hoped by pleas, threats, exaggerations, and repeated assurances to avoid being pressed too closely or brought to a reckoning by coercive measures that would be embarrassing if not disastrous. But he was upset just then by another matter to which he did not allude to the letter in Hotchkiss, the disappearance of Galland with money and land titles in his possession. End quote. The disappearance of Galland. All right, continuing on from a little bit later on in that same passage. Galland had the confidence of Smith and was a natural choice to be one of the agents to trade for eastern lands and handle the Hotchkiss payments. But it was partly, if not primarily, his malfeasance that caused the sharp exchange of letters between Hotchkiss and the prophet. Smith Tuttle, one of the Hotchkiss partners, wrote the Mormon leader in September a soothing letter which detailed Galland's failure to follow through on his promises. In light of Tuttle's explanation, replied Smith, quote, my feelings are changed, and I think that you all had cause for complaining. Back to Flanders. Brother Hiram had been forced by ill health to return to Nauvoo, leaving the whole of the business in Galland's hands. Why he has not done according to my instructions, wrote Smith, God only knows. The prophet, though worried, was not yet ready to admit that the esteemed doctor might have absconded with the funds. End quote. So once Joe had learned of Galland's return to the West, he immediately wrote the doctor, asking for his company in a conference. They shared strongly worded correspondence, and the phrasing Joe used seems to exhibit that he thought Galland might have a little something to hide. Now, Joe's first letter to Galland is not extant, unfortunately, but Galland's reply follows, and I'm reading this from Cook's article, Isaac Galland, Mormon Benefactor. Once again, you'll find it in the show notes. Quote, I enjoy a moderate degree of health, and shall certainly give myself the pleasure in a few days of visiting my brethren and friends at Nauvoo. I am now awaiting the arrival of a gentleman from St. Louis, whom I have promised to meet at this place on very important business. As soon as I have met with him and made arrangements, I shall proceed to an immediate interview with you. End quote. After 1 month had passed, and Dr. Galland had not made good on this letter, he did not come back to Nauvoo yet, Joseph Smith was led to write, quote, I am very much in want of assistance at this particular time, and if you can make it convenient to call on me within 2 or 3 days, I shall be much pleased. If not, I wish you would send by the bearer all the funds you possibly can, as my wants are very great. End quote. Joseph was getting a little insistent on trying to get the money from Galland to pay back Hotchkiss. Then, of course, Dr. Galland penned the following reply, quote, I am at a loss to determine whether you intended it to be an absolute done or an appeal to my liberality to advance fund for your relief, but let it be either case. I assure you, sire, it is not in my power to advance at this time $5 until I obtain it from my creditors or in some other way. As to coming to Nauvoo, I have long desired to come there, and shall certainly do so as soon as I can so arrange the matters which I am now engaged in. End quote. The letter exchange lasted for the last few months of 1841, and it wasn't until January of 1842 that Galland finally returned to Nauvoo. At this time, the Mormons, well, I should say Joseph, was behind multiple payments to Horace Hotchkiss. Joe was anxious to get a hold of the deeds and the funds that Galland had collected as an agent of the church. It couldn't be ignored that Galland held significant leverage over Joe and the church. I mean, think about this. Galland had sold them tens of thousands of acres in Iowa and Nauvoo. Joe was on the hook to repay Galland $50,000 over a 20-year period. He had a bit of leverage. So now we're picking back up in Flanders' Kingdom on the Mississippi, page 132. Quote, In a letter to Hotchkiss on December 10, 1841, Smith referred to the inefficiency, neglect, or sickness of Dr. Galland as a cause of their difficulty. When Galland finally returned to the vicinity of Nauvoo, apparently in December or January of 1842, bringing him to account proved difficult. On January 17th and 18th, Smith and Galland exchanged letters, neither of which is extant. Galland's language apparently served to warn Smith that if Galland were pressed for a close accounting of his agency, he might in return call for debts due him from the church. He was certainly in a position to cause an uproar and a scandal over the complex credit arrangements within the church. Perhaps he threatened foreclosure on Iowa lands as well." End quote. The conciliatory wording of Joe's letter in response to this correspondence, which is no longer extant, shows that Joe fully grasped this situation. Galland owned a ton of land the Mormons had merely settled on with the promise to eventually pay for that land. Joe had no liquid cash and no source of income to pay all of these defaulted payments that he had missed with Galland and Hotchkiss. Galland still held the deeds to all the Mormon lands that they had settled on, yet Joe relied on Galland to collect land deeds and donations from Mormons in the East to pay back Hotchkiss, who was much more scrupulous with his business practices than Galland was. This was a terrifyingly complex web of creditors and land trades, and each piece of the equation relied on every other piece for the whole thing to work. But unfortunately, as so often happened for Joe, when he orchestrated this massive web of land speculation, everything quickly fell apart, and all of the twirling plates came crashing down. And Joe alone was left to blame for the fallout of all of this chaos. In January of 1842, in response to Galland not making a full account of the funds that he'd collected, Joe revoked his status as agent of the church. And Isaac Galland was seldom heard from again in the annals of Mormon history. It should be noted, Galland was never punished for what happened. He was never brought to an ecclesiastical tribunal. He never was excommunicated or disfellowshipped. It was just his status as agent of the church that was revoked in response to him possibly absconding with thousands of dollars of church funds. So let's review everything that we've seen in Galland's trajectory in his church career in the brief 2 years that he associated with the Mormons. Galland was a land speculator who saw an opportunity to get comfortably wealthy from the Mormon refugees, moving to an area where he held significant acreage in 1839. Galland was able to convince Joe that he was a stand-up guy and he was acting in good faith, so the prophet signed various contracts with him for roughly 20,000 acres at $2.50 per acre, totaling roughly $50,000. Realizing that Mormons are more likely to do business with fellow Mormons, Galland was baptized into the church in late 1839, and he was given elder status almost immediately as he was appointed land agent on behalf of the church. He spent the following 2 years handling land transactions whilst proselyting. It's also worth mentioning here that Galland actually authored and published a few tracts about Mormonism from Ohio and Pennsylvania during his trips to the eastern states. His missions weren't just land acquisition, he also was spreading the good word, and he shared the plight of the Mormon refugees whilst he was traveling about. Finally, by the end of 1841 and beginning of 1842, Galland was on the prophet's bad side, possibly having stole hundreds or thousands of dollars from the church. And unfortunately, it's not easy to say that he stole that money from the church without qualifying that. His monetary obligations and relationship with the church was far more complicated than just saying he stole from the church. That doesn't sufficiently explain what happened. Galland had used church funds that he had personally collected to fund the various tracts and articles that he had published. He also likely used church money he'd collected to fund the living expenses of his mission, and he probably lived rather comfortably while he was out proselyting and collecting these funds. But let's also examine what the main purpose of this mission was. Galland was sent to the Mormons living in the eastern states to tell them how great Nauvoo was and to petition them to move to Nauvoo and sign their land deeds over to him in exchange for Nauvoo land. Those Mormons didn't know who Isaac Galland was. Now granted, Hiram's sidekick Abiff and a few other trusted elites accompanied him at various times during these missions, but Galland was a new Mormon on the block. What reason did they have to trust him? What reason did they have to trust that Joseph Smith was acting in good faith in all of this? Try to take the Mormons' mentality into consideration here. These are Mormons who hadn't followed Joe from Kirtland to Missouri or Missouri to Illinois in the first place. They were apathetic when it came to divine dictates to pick up everything and start a new life in a brand new location. Yet suddenly, this Galland guy just shows up on their doorstep and tells them that Joe and the Mormons are building a new settlement in Illinois at this time. What reason did they have to believe that the Mormons wouldn't be chased out of Illinois and Iowa just as they had been from Missouri and Ohio? It was those apathetic Mormons' friends and family who had settled in Missouri only to be removed from the state a mere year after putting down roots. They watched that happen. What was to stop that from all happening again with the Mormon settlement in Illinois and Iowa? Many of these settlers were also aware that the Mississippi area was a disease-ridden swampland. There weren't any major agricultural operations, no factories, no infrastructure awaiting them should they decide to move to the new settlement, and they were living comfortable lives where they already were. What was the appeal to pack up everything and start a new life except for just pleasing the prophet and his wacky speculations? These factors and the general apathy of the Mormons with whom Galland was meeting doomed his mission from the very beginning. Now, we can't fault Galland for this because he collected as many land deeds and donations that he could, but I can only imagine that he was met with extremely limited success. I mean, with an accruing debt of nearly $200,000 in Joe's name from the last year alone, even if every one of the 10,000 Mormons at this time gave $10, they'd only be halfway to paying off that debt. And it's realistic to assume that maybe, 3 to 5% of the Mormons gave anything to Galland at this time? Maybe some of them gave as much as a few $100s, or they signed over a few dozen acres of land. But that couldn't even make the slightest dent in the debts that Joe had acquired in the past 2 years of Mormonism alone. That says nothing of his past debts from Ohio and Missouri that were still plaguing Joe every time he turned around. As was the case with all of Mormon history, Joe was in dire straits again. And his straits seemed to widen and encompass more people and larger debts as he progressed, but they were always utterly and completely dire. Chaos was the only ruling constant throughout all Mormon history. Unfortunately for Joe, and by extension all the Mormons, Joe didn't live life by his own principle when he wrote to Galland in attempt to acquire the funds after Galland's mission, quote, "Short reckonings make long friends," end quote. So let's sit back. How does this apply to today? With all of this information in front of us, when did Joe's religious endeavor become a financial enterprise? What caused Joe to spend so much time and effort on money? And just how much time and effort did he spend on money and failed business ventures instead of on his religion? When did the balance shift where he spent more time being a businessman instead of a profit man? At what point did profit become his primary focus instead of being a prophet? Just jump back to the first question. Did Joseph Smith start Mormonism just for the money? Joe's childhood and teenage years were spent in destitution. He spent much of his time attending churches and these open-air revivals just watching the preachers collect plates of money from congregations. So, did Joe start Mormonism just for the money? Maybe. A lot of factors went into founding the Mormon religion, and nobody could say that the prospect of making a lot of money wasn't one of the primary factors. At the end of the day, though, does it really matter if Joe had money on his mind when he started the church? Speculation surrounding this subject says nothing of the modern-day LDS Church. I mean, sure, it's fun to point to various revelations and show just how early into the foundation of the church God decided to intervene with monetary affairs, but that exercise doesn't make the church today any more or less of a business. That's just what it is. The corporation of the President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's a multi-billion-dollar worldwide corporation. The modern church today is a company. It wasn't until the latter half of the 20th century where the church began diversifying investments into like nationwide agriculture and media business and everything like that. But long before then, Brigham had been running the church like it was a business, and Joe spent much of his time on business instead of ecclesiastical matters. You know, it'd be hard to call him prophet instead of CEO most days. But just because a business happens to run a non-profit arm, that doesn't mean it should get away with what it does. And of course, I'm taking everything in this episode to this point and applying rationale to what's going on publicly with the church right now in coming to my conclusions. But let's play with some hypotheticals here, okay? If a school was teaching your children that Native Americans are descendants from Israelites and that the African Americans aren't allowed into heaven because they aren't white and delightsome, you'd pull them out of that school immediately and you would seek disaccreditation from the county superintendent. If a local bookstore required you to meet with the manager to make sure that you haven't recently masturbated before they allowed you to shop in that bookstore, you'd be in your right mind to never shop there and call the manager a sexual pervert on your way out of his office. If a local golf club required you to dress up in weird clothes and swear blood oaths of vengeance on the rifle disc golf course next door, whilst forcing you to do special handshakes and passwords just to get in, you'd withdraw your dues and you'd never look back. If a magazine subscription service required you to cancel all your other memberships and said that you could never read unapproved rival magazines or else your membership would be canceled, you'd hopefully say, okay, then cancel my membership and I'll never read another word of the magazine that you produce for the rest of your days, regardless of how useful that information is. And finally, if I may borrow Dan Savage's analogy here, if kids got raped at Denny's as often as they get raped at church, it would be illegal to take your kids to Denny's. If any major company of any kind had hundreds of allegations of mental, physical, and sexual abuse and subsequent covering up of that abuse, people would lose their fucking minds and rightfully call for the prosecution and imprisonment of the people responsible. The company would immediately be dissolved and the people would rightfully desire a lynching in the streets. No organization gets to do any of this shit without it being morally reprehensible, ethically questionable, or straight up illegal. But because this one company with 16 million customers happens to run a non-profit arm under the guise of religion, the corporation of the President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints does every single one of these deplorable things, and they feel fucking attacked when people voice opposition. The church is a business. What's happening with the Protect LDS Children March and the Joseph Bishop sex abuse revelation, this is a PR nightmare for this massive corporation. And to see them sick the attack dogs on anybody speaking up about this and all of the victim blaming, it's fucking sickening. This corporation can do whatever it wants, and it has the balls to demand 10% of your income. Look, I've come a long way in the past 3.5 years of doing this podcast. When I started this endeavor in November of 2014, I was mad. I had to work through so many complicated emotions, and the fury caused me to see everything in red. But that fueled the fire in my bosom to persevere. I've since evolved to appreciate Mormon history at a much more intellectual level, and it's easy to chart the progress of my tone and focus as I personally have evolved along with the evolution of this podcast. But when issues like the Joseph Bishop interview and this Protect LDS Children campaign come up, it rekindles all those old emotions lying dormant in the pit of my stomach, and I want to see this goddamn empire burn to the ground with truth, just like every other ex-Mormon who's just as infuriated as yours truly. We've collectively let the church get away with murder for too long. We can't blame the church for using the license we've given it to abuse its members with its own power. The church isn't at fault for letting things get this far. We are. The church has illustrated time and again that they won't move until outside pressure becomes too much to bear. My greatest fear is that the church is going to Teflon this issue, just like every other major issue in its past. It's never been held accountable for degrading our humanity. The church is a fucking parasite, defiling our best natures, holding back progress, claiming responsibility for the best of human advancement, while at the same time washing its hands of responsibility of its own deplorable actions. When people stand up and say, hey, you can't do that anymore, the church just reassures us that they've handled the matter internally, and they have a no-tolerance policy in place, so there's nothing to see here, move along. Fuck that. When we allow a company to police itself, abuse of power and ignoring laws happens every goddamn time. Something bears repeating here. Even though I've said it multiple times in this show, I don't take issue with Mormons. Mormons are my friends, my family, my loved ones, and some of the nicest strangers I've ever met. These problems are the product of Mormonism as a corporation. It's not caused by any individual Mormon. But Mormonism is made up of Mormons. The sum is no greater than the accrual of the constituent parts, and there's plenty of blame to go around. The fact of the matter is, Mormons are deeply indoctrinated to blindly follow authority. Once the leadership has spoken, the thinking has been done. The massive edifice Mormonism has built into its indoctrination structure instills a feeling of complete impotence in the mind of every one of the millions of followers. But Mormons hold the power here. Mormonism is nothing without Mormons. Every so often, the church needs to be reminded of this inconvenient little fact. When an organization departs from the will of its people, it's up to those people to say, fuck you, see you later, time's up, we're done. Either do what we want or say goodbye to those precious membership dues and watch those emptying Gothic monoliths become liabilities instead of investments. There are no more sacred cows. There are no more kid gloves. This shit has gone too far. People blindly yielding their autonomy to faceless authority in our enlightened age is unacceptable. And it represents our greatest failing as a social species. We're sitting back and watching our fellow humans be mentally, emotionally, and sexually abused every day. How much is too much? How many children killing themselves out of shame for having sexual desires are we willing to tolerate? How many people being afraid of sex and intimacy is too many? How many sex abuse allegations are settled out of court is too many? How much blood will we allow this parasite to suck from us before we pluck it off and incinerate the little bastard? How long of granting one entity unfettered access and unchecked power in politics is too long? This shit has gone way too far, you guys. Doesn't matter where you are on the Mormon belief spectrum. Believers and non-believers should be equally outraged at the recent egregious abuse of power. We wouldn't let any massive company get away with what the church does, but because it happens to run a religion, Mormon Inc. gets a pass with absolutely no transparency or oversight. Opposing Mormonism isn't an anti-Mormon conspiracy. It's an issue affecting our collective humanity. And it's hard to talk about this. Sex abuse, mental and emotional abuse, and a religion covering it up is a complex topic. And it becomes infinitely more complex when it's the religion that you believe in. But these conversations need to happen. This is a business. We live during a rare time in human history where the pen is truly mightier than the sword, and the almighty dollar supersedes the strength of any pen. It's time to make the church hurt for abusing its power the only way it responds to. Anyone who pays their tithing is funding the active cover-up of sexual abuse, a shadow organization with incredibly powerful political lobbying power. And anyone supporting this multi-billion-dollar organization deserves derision, shame, and accosting at every level. Every Mormon swearing fealty to the church in a baker's cap and green apron is just as responsible as every one of us on the outside for not saying anything in opposition to the church. This shit has gone too far. Enough is enough. Go to the march. This is but one more battle on a never-ending war against this massive corporation. This is how wars are fought now. We wage battle in the streets with petition signs and pens. We wage battle by not giving money to this organization. We wage battle by not attending chapels. Today, the weapons we wield are keyboards instead of swords or guns. And every single voice out there is a force multiplier. We need everybody we can get in this fight. Please come to the march. This is a crucial event in our time. Out of the small handful of conflicts that are called Mormon wars throughout American history, this is the Mormon War of the 21st century. All right, that does it for today. Next week's episode is going to air a couple of days early. I am still tampering around with exactly how to do this, but it will be dealing with this recent leak that came out about the Joseph Bishop interview. There's a lot to talk about. The dust has settled in a lot of respects, but there's still so much happening actively in the Mormon PR headlines, and this is an ever-evolving issue. I would like to get on Ryan and Ethan of the Mormon Leaks team to discuss this issue, but it's currently up in the air of whether or not they will be available at the time that I'll be recording this. We'll have to see how that goes, but the episode will air a few days early because when they air regularly on Thursday nights, that means that it hits your podcast feed when you wake up on Friday morning. But next week's episode will be, once again, a petition to get people out to the Protect LDS Children March, because I'm not shutting up about this. I don't care what you guys say. I'm sorry if I'm harping on this too much. This is just too important to not talk about. So next week's episode will be centered around the Joseph Bishop interview and all of the fallout from this and what is happening and how the church has responded to this. It's wildly complex and there's a lot to tease out of it. I just want to give my take on it as much as I possibly can. We'll see how it develops, but that's going to air a few days before the march to give people a chance to listen to it, and hopefully you'll listen to it before. And if you're still on the fence, if you're a fence sitter about attending the march, maybe that episode will push you over the edge. We'll see how it goes, but that's it for today's episode. Thank you so much to Julie for running the Twitter and Facebook pages, for being our social media guru and keeping the conversation going over there. Thank you so much to Natalie Newell for lining up so many interviews and being the production assistant on the back end. Thank you to Jason Comeau for providing the music used in the show with his permission. You can find more of his music at aloststateofmind.com. Thanks to Andrew Torres of the Law Offices of P. Andrew Torres for providing the legal counsel for this show. Thank you so much to all the patron supporters who support the show at patreon.com/Naked Mormonism and gain access to ad-free editions of the show and a whole bunch of extra content. And thank you most importantly to all of you listeners out there for sticking in there. Sorry I let the old Bryce come out. Talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism podcast. go to the march. The preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2018, all rights reserved.